All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. And now it's 9:01, so let's get started. Welcome to the first morning session of the day. Before we get started, just a quick plug for the forums mural, the link to which is in the chat or will be in a minute. It's really informative to see what others remark on, so if you feel like it, please contribute a thought or two. I also want to announce that we're going to send out a survey. Please check for the link in the chat as well. And please fill it out. It will help us to close the loop, the adaptive management loop, and improve the third adaptive management forum in 2 years. You may have heard this a couple times by now, but the presentations during the forum are being recorded and will be available on the Delta Stewardship Council's website in a couple of weeks. Also, the presentations, the slides will be available as well. Okay, so let's get going. The topic of this session is mechanisms of adaptive management. We have a set of 5 great talks that present tools and practices that have been used successfully to support adaptive management. There are many mechanisms or tools that can help make adaptive management happen. They include environmental data resources that are important for modeling and monitoring, data management and analysis, scenario planning tools, the writing of good adaptive management plans, but also pilot studies, permitting mechanisms, and incorporating adaptive management into funding proposals. And the list here is probably not complete. My unit, the Adaptive Management Unit of the Delta Science Program, together with the Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team, has been working to provide some resources to facilitate adaptive management, which are available on the Delta Stewardship Council's website. Sessions and workshops in the past 2 days have addressed different mechanisms of adaptive management. And during this morning session, we want to focus on a few more. So to tie today's talks together, I want to note how they relate to the adaptive management wheel that you now have seen several times in the last days. On my count, this is about the 8th presentation to show it. The talk by Gina Darren presents a pilot study on invasive plant management. And pilot studies, by definition, go through the entire adaptive management cycle with the goal of informing future actions and future projects that hopefully will also go through the adaptive management cycle. This is really driving home the importance of all the fat arrows going from step 9, adapt, to the planning stages of adaptive management, and noting that this transcends individual projects. The talk by Sarah Lesmeister also relates to the entire adaptive management cycle. Sarah is talking about incorporating adaptive management into funding proposals and thereby addresses a common problem of adaptive management and monitoring funding. The other 3 talks present tool sets that can support adaptive management of multiple projects. Rosemary Hartman discusses how to use conceptual models to build a monitoring plan, which fits into step 3, model linkages between objectives and proposed actions, and into step 6, design and implement monitoring plan. Rod Whitler will share the use of structured decision-making that his group is using to identify, prioritize, and implement actions by the Central Valley Project Improvement Act FISH program as part of a larger adaptive management framework. So here, structured decision-making is a systematic approach to selecting actions, which is step 4 in the adaptive management wheel. And Chris Bowles will talk about the Southport levee setback project, focusing on quantitative modeling, which is often important in step 3 of the wheel, model linkages between objectives and proposed actions. And now, without further ado, I'd like to ask Gina Darren with the Department of Water Resources to present on Think Big, Start Small, invasive vegetation pilot studies to inform large-scale restoration management.
Thank you.
Oops.
Are you seeing my presentation mode?
Yes.
Are you seeing my mouse cursor moving around?
No. Yes.
Well,
yes, I am.
Great. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, organizers, for inviting me today to present. My name is Gina Darren. I am a senior environmental scientist with the Department of Water Resources in the Fish Restoration Program. I'm going to be calling that FERP from here on out. So FERP is an effort to restore more than 8,000 acres of tidal wetland habitat for listed fish species as mitigation for the State Water Project. So my team is working to use research and pilot studies to inform those full-scale implementation projects and inform the adaptive management of those restoration sites to hopefully improve the restoration outcomes. So there aren't many studies that are happening ahead of and alongside restoration in the Delta, and that was why I was asked to present here today. The goal of this presentation is to introduce you to the 3 pilot studies going on that are still underway, not complete, and they aim toward making management recommendations for their adjacent restoration sites. So the adaptive management big question is there something we can do in the design phase of restoration planning to limit invasive species establishment for all the many reasons you want to do that? I acknowledge my team up front. These research studies are a huge team effort. Fish Restoration Program and UC Davis staff are conducting most of the on-the-ground work, along with the California Conservation Corps, Solitude Lake Management, Bright and WEC labs. Our stakeholders, all of you, thank you, and especially DWR management, who have been very supportive of these pilot studies. And a mega shout out to our funders, the Delta Conservancy Prop 1 grant program and the Fish Restoration Program. So overall, for the research program I'm conducting, the objectives, and I realize these are not SMART objectives, but you get the idea. There are 2 main objectives. One is the ecological objective, and that is to reduce the rate of invasive species establishment on our restoration sites to improve the fish habitat. Then there's the business case objective. This is very important. So we're monitoring the effort involved in revegetation and invasive species removal so that we can hopefully decrease costs for maintenance on the other side of restoration once the the restoration sites have been implemented. So let me introduce you, if you don't know them already, to the invaders. So my studies are looking at Ludwigia, or invasive water primrose. This is our site in the Delta. And then Phragmites, that's me standing there in the Phragmites for a sense of scale. And then this was there are a lot of adaptive management surprises that happen in projects. You all know this, but alligator weed showed up at our Dutch Slough site in our final year, this past year of monitoring. So that was a surprise. And then we have our heroes, the native plants. The Shaina Plectus acutus, which we're using for revegetation at our Delta site and our Sassoon Marsh sites. I like to call this one the big tule. And then smartweed. So this is a kind of a float. It's like a floating yet rooted plant that has a very similar morphology to Ludwigia. If you see this is at Prospect Island, it's very dense. So I was hoping it would be very robust to fill the space instead of the Ludwigia. This is Shaina Plectus Americanus. This is the tule that in cross section looks like a Star Wars Imperial shuttle. You know what I'm talking about. And then the large broadleaf cattail Typholatifolia. So these are the plants we used for our revegetation studies. Those studies are happening here in Sassoon Marsh at Bradmore Island and Blacklock, and here in the Delta at the Dutch Slough Restoration Site. So let's zoom in to Dutch. All right, so this is the larger polygon is the larger Dutch Slough Restoration Site. This is an image I just pulled off of Google Earth, and I'm very excited about all this earth moving they've done so far. So that's cool. That's gonna be another presentation, hopefully someday. But this spot right here on the edge of the third parcel is my study site. And what we're looking at here is, can we use active revegetation once weeds have been cleared in an open tidal situation down here, where such that we can limit the reestablishment of the dominant invader, which here is water primrose. This is a drone image of our site before Boating and Waterways removed as much as they could of the water primrose. Thank you, Boating and Waterways. We have 3 treatments and 1 control, replicated 3 times in blocks. The treatments are planting the big tule, planting smartweed, and then planting the combo of both of them together, and then having an unvegetated control, which is kind of a passive, would be like passive revegetation. We harvested the tules on site, and we, while smartweed is present, it was not present in the abundance that we felt comfortable harvesting it and moving it around. So we did get our smartweed from Prospect Island. All right, so here's a picture of once the sites of the blocks were cleared. Before we did plantings, that's where they are, as if you're looking from the levee edge. The CCC crew was amazing. If you haven't had a chance to work with these folks, they are fantastic. So they're harvesting the tules for us there. And before I go on, I want to tell you one more adaptive management surprise we had at the Dutch Slough site, and that was the Santa Rosa fires. So we were all set to go to install the treatments in 2017, and that was the year the Santa Rosa fires happened. And I actually remember going to the State of the Estuary Conference in Oakland, driving through the smoke and talking with Karen about this study. Well, our CCC crew got pulled onto firefighting duty, so we weren't able to implement that year, so we had to wait a year. So the surprise, let's see. This is a picture of us installing the revegetation plots. So you can see smartweed. It was not thrilled about the drive from Prospect Island to Dutch. So there's some lessons being learned there. And then another adaptive management surprise. So here's a picture of blocks 1 and 2, looking from the levee. You can see we've installed our treatments. The tules are not dead. They are senescing. You can see them tied up there to their stakes. Well, we call this Dock Gate 2018. You never know when a giant floating dock is going to hit your treatment sites. So that was a surprise. We swam it out on the next high tide, and by we, I mean Jamie Silva, so thank you, Jamie. And then actually one way to turn a problem into an asset is we harvested the floating foam from the dock and actually used it while we were doing our monitoring, because this mud is really mucky. Anyone who knows working in tidal muck is hard to move around in, so we actually used them as floats, which was pretty handy. All right, so that project is, we're still we just finished monitoring and we're analyzing the data. So we will let you know what we've learned from there, hopefully in a future presentation. So now let's move to Sassoon Marsh. We've got Bradmore Island Restoration Site and the Blacklock Restoration Site. On Bradmore, our study site for our revegetation plots is right there in the circle. So, and then also I want to point out that Arnold is this property right here. That's also a FERP restoration site, so you can see a lot of restoration happening in this area right here. All right, so there's Ted Groschholz getting a lay of the land. We asked our contractors to remove and disc the vegetation to prep our site. So that's an acre of cleared out area. Here, the question that we're asking is, not only what species will be robust against or competitive against the dominant invader Phragmites for revegetation, but also which stage when you go to replant is the most cost effective. So here we have 3 stages of 3 species: seeds, adults, and rhizomes of Typholetifolia, Shaina Plectus acutus, and Shaina Plectus Americanus, repeated 4 times in 4 blocks. Okay, we have a lot of fun. This is just another CCC crew helped us do both harvesting the material the native plant material on site and moving it into our research plots. And here's what the blocks looked like right after we did the revegetation. So you can see it's pretty clear. Well, while, actually I forgot to mention this before, at Dutch Slough, another adaptive management surprise was that the water primrose reinvaded super quick, super fast. That was like, whoa. And then here at Blacklock, fortunately, our invader Phragmites, which is all around, did not invade the plots fast enough. We ended up having to plant it inside the plots to get a sense of how competitive our natives were going to be against Phragmites, and it still didn't really take. So that was interesting. Although we'll give Phragmites an A for effort. Look at that rhizome. Whew, swimming. Also at Bradmore, we are doing an observational study of arthropod diversity in Phragmites stands versus the native vegetation to get a sense for if a monoculture of Phragmites supports diversity in a higher trophic level. We are still analyzing the data, but I will just say it's looking like the diversity of arthropods in the tules is higher than Phrag, but more to come on that. All right, so we are still analyzing the data from the revegetation study, and we'll hopefully present that at a future conference. So now I'm going to move from not a revegetation study, but a devegetation study. So Blacklock has been mentioned several times already in the forum. It's one of the oldest restoration sites in Sassoon Marsh, and it is highly invaded by Phragmites. And my major concern is that this is a nursery for Phragmites into Bradmore and Arnold once those sites are breached. So what can we do about the Phragmites here, and what can we learn from it? So the objectives of this study are to, one, look at tools that we have available to us for what's the most effective at removing Phragmites, and also look at the off-target impacts to water quality, food web, and non-target plants, because there's some rare plants in here. And we have, you can see we have 5 treatments and a control replicated 3 times. Oh boy, these projects are fun. Okay, so this is the Marshmaster. It's an amphibious vehicle that we used in the first year to both mark out the plots and administer the herbicide treatments. We mow as well using weed whackers. And then this is another another fun, happy adaptive management surprise. Our drone monitoring picked up a derelict canoe in the middle of Blacklock. We went to investigate. It looked very abandoned, no ID tags, so we employed it as a barge to help us haul the mowed Phragmites off-site and into the landfill. So that was fun. Use your resources. Lots of monitoring on all the projects. For Blacklock, we're doing physical vegetation monitoring, drone monitoring. Here's a drone image. These brown squares are our treated Phragmites plots. And then we do water quality monitoring by kayak. You can see this is one of the plots that had been treated. So this is a lot. I'll ask you to look at the y-axis, which is NDVI. This is a measure of vegetative health. We'll say 1 is a very happy, healthy plant, and 0 is, well, not. We applied our treatments, first treatment in October of 2019. Look at the control plot. This is the plot that was not treated. You know, at first everybody went into senescence, and then in spring they come out of senescence and the control plot is happy, happy, healthy, and all the treated plots are struggling. This held throughout the season, and then we applied our second treatment in the following September and October. These are drone data from October, so they actually don't show yet what's happening when they. We're going to look forward to seeing what happens when they come out of senescence, like what now, soon. That's exciting. So we're confident the treatments are working as far as efficacy on Phragmites. We're also confident we're having very little off-target impact. These are the water quality data from the first year. You can see we did detect herbicide in the water. However, it was minimal. So in conclusion, the original question I asked you was, is there something we can do at the design phase of restoration planning to limit invasive species establishment? I will say most likely yes. We have an enthusiastic thumbs up here. Pilot studies do inform restoration. We're learning lessons we weren't looking to learn, but we're capturing them all. We are still putting our management recommendations together, so stay tuned for that. But I can share with certainty that pilot studies, ideally ahead of a restoration site, will be worth their weight in gold. So next steps for us are to complete the data analysis, reflect on and share our lessons learned, make our management recommendations and communicate those. Ideally, the information we gain will facilitate permitting for the larger projects and then full-scale implementation. So for example, at Blacklock, we're hoping to do full-scale Phragmites control, and then with this fantastic herbicide spraying drone, and then revegetate using what we learned at the other two research sites. So with that, I will leave you with a poem. I realize we're short on time, so feel free to screenshot that. You're welcome to reach out to me with any questions if we don't have time right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darren. That was, sorry, Gina. Looking at your little name there, picking the first one. Mistake. Gina, thank you so much. That was really interesting. We do have time for a couple questions. And if you have any, please raise your hand or type it into the chat. But in the meantime, while we're waiting, I have one. Sometimes pilot studies seem to be really important, but then scaling them up is difficult. Is that something that you considered right from the start, where you picked your treatments based on the possibility of scaling them up?
Yes, we definitely learned that it is a lot of work to work with a small team to do the active revegetation. We're working with the Dutch Slough larger restoration team. They're scaling up. For example, they created a tule farm and are moving tules around that way. So we will be able to make recommendations on scaling up. The Bradmore experiment is showing, our data are showing that actually the rhizome treatment is doing just as well, if not better, than the adult treatment. We thought, planting a full adult would give it the best chance of survival of the transplant, but we're finding the rhizomes are doing great, and that is a lot cheaper to move rhizomes than it is full adults. So that's going to be one of our recommendations. The seeds did not germinate. We were warned about that. So we are actually conducting another study on trying to encourage the seeds to germinate in the lab to see kind of if we need a cold treatment or scarification or something like that. Because obviously seeds would be like the most economical if we could get them to germinate when you want to scale up. And then the Phragmites, yeah, it is very expensive to bring a Marshmaster in, but that was because we needed very precise like scientific rigor on this experiment. When we go for the whole site, we're confident that the drone will be able to do it much faster and much less expensive.
Okay, thank you. Ramona, you have a question. Would you like me to read it, or would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure, I'll read it. So Gina, one thing that often restoration projects have requirement for, in their permits, no invasive cover increase at certain percentage, which, as we know, in Sassoon Marsh, there's a lot of invasives there. Any insights on how to talk with permitting agencies for something that's kind of realistic and achievable?
Appreciate that question. My group yesterday and the day before in the permitting and in the Adaptive Management 101 workshops, we grappled with this. I understand that the agencies have thresholds that they need to abide by. Nature does not cooperate. For example, at Bradmore Island, I know that we set a threshold in our permits for the restoration site of X invasive species cover, and unfortunately, even before construction, the Phragmites has exceeded that. So we're not quite sure how to walk that line, but I'm hoping that from this forum and future conversations with the agencies, we can try to figure out something that works for all of us.
Great. Well, hope folks from BCDC are able to take this in and adapt.
All right, thank you so much, Gina. We're out of time
you.
for questions. There is one more from Louise that you can maybe answer in the chat. And now I would like to introduce Rosemary Hartman from the Department of Water Resources, and she is going to talk on conceptual models, from conceptual to concrete, using models to build a monitoring plan. Rosie, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Get my screen shared. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be talking more about wetland management. All right. Great. Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Rosemary Hartman, and I'm from the Department of Water Resources. And I'm actually doing this as a bit of a throwback to my former life as a member of the Fish Restoration Program monitoring team. And Gina talked a little bit about FERP in her talk, and Stacy talked about FERP previously. So it's one of the, I think, flagship programs for wetland restoration and adaptive management in the Delta that I was really proud to be a part of. And I'm here to talk about how the program got started with its monitoring plans and how we use conceptual models to help build those monitoring plans. So as several people have now mentioned, the basic problem that FERP was dealing with was Delta smelt. And we all know they've been in decline. So bringing up our favorite adaptive management wheel, first we need to define the problem if we're going to monitor these wetland sites. And there's obviously a number of problems that Delta smelt have had contributing to their decline. Habitat loss, one of the big ones, food limitation, invasive weeds, predation, water diversion, contaminants, climate change, a whole slew of stuff. And the fish restoration program knew, okay, we can't deal with all of these programs, but hopefully we can deal with at least one of those problems. So the problem that we're particularly wanting to deal with, decline of Delta smelt, is habitat loss. So we need, a goal for how we're going to reverse habitat loss. And the big method we're going to use to reduce that habitat loss is, of course, restoration. The basic idea was that tidal wetland restoration will help increase resilience of salmon and smelt. So Fish Restoration Program, which is a collaboration between CDFW and DWR, they had the goal of restoring 8,000 acres of tidal wetland restoration to produce better individual food supply for fish, better condition, better overall population for salmon and smelt. So we like saying the goal is fat, happy fish. And this restoration is included in the biological opinions for operation of the State and Central Valley Water Project. And not only did they have restoration in the BIOPS, but they required adaptive management and effectiveness monitoring of these restoration sites. So it wasn't enough to just build it. You had to monitor and see whether it was working. That was our goal. Fat, happy fish, 8,000 acres of tidal wetland restoration. But the next step in our model, where we spent a lot of our time, was we needed to really be clear on what the linkage between wetland restoration and fat, happy fish really was. We had some ideas about it, but there isn't that much wetland in the Delta left. So we didn't have a lot of research really showing the connection between the fish and the wetlands. And when the Fish Restoration Program got started, we were a pretty small group, 2 environmental scientists, a senior ES, a program manager, and a lab assistant. And, the small group of us, we knew some stuff about wetlands and fish, but had never restored anything before. And we were tasked with, coming up with these linkages. So instead of trying to do it all ourselves, we started the IEP Tidal Wetlands Monitoring Project Work Team. We got all of the experts in fish, wetlands, restoration together in a room to really talk about the connections between the restoration sites and the fish. And when you have a group of people from, I think there's probably 100 people on the email list for this project work team. We have a group from different agencies, NGOs, universities, all getting together, trying to decide what the most important parts of monitoring these sites is. It got pretty messy. So we wanted to use the modeling of the effectiveness of these restoration sites as a way to get all of these people thinking in the same direction so we could really hone in on what we should monitor. So we developed conceptual models. So we had some idea about how things worked. Kind of, okay, we got this wetland and the water flows in and out. There's these intertidal channels that allow the fish access to the marsh. The marsh is going to have a bunch of bugs in it. There's, pelagic production out here. We're going to have to worry about weeds. But we wanted to really make this explicit, drill down into all of the details behind how we think this worked. So we made a lot of box and arrow diagrams. There were a lot of drafts. There were submodels. There was a lot of time spent with whiteboards and PowerPoint drawing out, okay, which components of the wetland is going to be affected by which other components, and how will that affect fish? So we made these series of conceptual models and backed them up with a amazing amount of text. I think the final document has like 300, 400 pages in it. And the diagram for this model is based on the one from the Delta Smelts mast conceptual model, if you're familiar with that one. Our end result, flux of production and target species presence. Okay, so we want salmon and smelt on the wetland. We want production to be moving off the wetland, or at least being made available over certain times of the tidal cycle. These things up here are actually really difficult to measure. Catching fish is hard. You don't know whether you didn't catch fish because they weren't there or because you just couldn't catch them. Delta smelt are getting harder and harder to find these days. And actually measuring flux of production is a really intensive study. So the rest of the model helped us hone in on other factors that are going on in the wetland that help support our listed species, but aren't actually the listed species themselves. So the things that most directly influence our outcome tier are the biotic site attributes, the food web, vegetation, and the physical site attributes, water quality, hydrology, etc. And the things on the site are all influenced by the local attributes, so things going on in neighboring wetlands and neighboring channels right around the site, and then the land, where the position on the landscape. So is it in the delta? Is it in Sassoon Marsh? Is it right off a Rain River, or is it in a backwater slough? And so this allowed us to show, okay, we know what's influencing the target species presence, and we can figure out how we are going to actually monitor that. So that was our model. Next, we needed to select our actions, our restoration, and develop performance measures. And the performance measures was another place where we could use our conceptual model. We took the box and arrow diagrams and used it to define real clear questions and hypotheses we could test on our site and use as performance measures. So we know overall, our hypothesis is that tidal wetlands are good for fish. But this is too big. It's hard to actually test, especially if you don't happen to be lucky enough to catch fish on your site. Because we had a lot of scientists in our project work team meetings, it was really easy to drill down into the really specific things like increase in amphipods will lead to increased body condition in juvenile salmonids. Might happen, but it's so specific that it'll just get us bogged down and we lose sight of the big picture about the wetland as a whole. So we settled on a list of hypotheses which you could test on any given restoration site, such as wetland restoration might increase wetland-associated invertebrates rather, contribution to the pelagic food web. It was something that we thought we could test. It wasn't so big that we lost sight of the main hypothesis. From these hypotheses, we needed to choose those performance metrics. So what are we going to measure on the site? As I mentioned before, it's really hard to measure the stuff up here, flux of production or target species presence. Whereas the biotic site attributes, food web, phytoplankton, zooplankton, vegetation, those we could measure, and they directly influence the target species. Physical site attributes, water quality, is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is the oxygen levels right? Those were also things we could measure easily and directly influence the outcomes we wanted. The local attributes, so what was going on in the surrounding area, were also things that were important, but they weren't quite as directly influencing what's going on the site as the things on the site. And they're already measured by existing programs. So instead of going out and monitoring phytoplankton in the surrounding channels ourselves, we could use EMP's data for that monitoring. And then the landscape attributes, things like where it is, what the seasonal patterns are, how the land use is in the surrounding area. Those are things that are important, but don't change very quickly. So we can usually just describe them in, the beginning of our analysis and don't have to monitor them on a regular basis. So from this, we chose a list of monitoring metrics that we thought were important, and we divided them between the primary things we were going to monitor on every site all the time, like chlorophyll A as a metric of phytoplankton. But then other things we might only measure if we really wanted to look at something in more detail. So maybe if there was really low zooplankton but high chlorophyll and we weren't sure why, then we might look at phytoplankton community composition, but otherwise we wouldn't. We also developed a list of higher function or special study metrics, things that would be great to look at, but probably weren't part of a regular monitoring program, like zooplankton growth rates in wetland water versus channel water. Great grad student projects. Those were our performance measures. Now the next two steps on the adaptive management cycle, I don't like very much because it says design and implement actions is step 5. Design and implement monitoring plan is step 6. These should really be reversed. You should be designing and implementing your monitoring program before you implement your actions so you can get some baseline data. But anyway, we needed a monitoring plan from those metrics. And the project work team, again, worked together to develop what we have called a monitoring framework, which is a document that's available for anyone who is starting a restoration site for fish. It focuses on effectiveness monitoring, takes a large-scale, long-term view of things, and focuses on creating comparable monitoring on all sorts of different restoration sites. And so we've taken this framework and modified it several times now for restoration sites. The framework includes standard methods. We have real specific SOPs for how to monitor the different metrics on each of the sites. And we have tried out all these methods ourselves. Tried some things that did not work, found some things that did work, got wet, got muddy. It was great fun. And so this is also available for anyone who's building a restoration site. The last couple steps that we're doing on our conceptual model, on our adaptive management cycle, is going back to our conceptual model and analyzing and synthesizing our results, trying to see, do our results fit the model that we made in the beginning? To do this, we describe the landscape attributes for a particular site. We use the long-term monitoring data from IEP and others to assess the local fish community, water quality, etc., surrounding the site. We take our on-site abiotic and biotic metrics and put them in our big data synthesizer here to try and see, are we getting the habitat and fish responses that we want? And this allows us to try and assess whether we're supporting our conceptual model, whether or not we actually catch the fish that we are hoping to influence. So, just to take us through the last two steps, since I'm got this wheel up, communicating current understanding through presentations like this one, through annual reports and publications. We are taking the support that we have for our conceptual model and putting it out there, showing what works, what doesn't work, and what we're finding on our sites to, hopefully adapt our conceptual model while necessary and inform future restoration sites. So that's where the adapt comes in. Some of this adaptation will be through changes to future restoration sites. Some of it will be to changes to our conceptual model, and some of it may be to actually modifying the sites that we've already built if we find something is not working. Finally, I'd really like to thank the rest of the Fish Restoration Program monitoring team and implementations team, all of the Tidal Wetlands Project Work team, the authors of those conceptual model reports, and a big special thanks to Stacy Sherman and Dave Contreras for being with at the beginning for the formation of these conceptual models and editing all of those conceptual model reports. I can take any questions.
Great, thank you, Rosie. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or just type it in. Giving you some time to think. I have one for you. Rosie, how important do you think it is to update conceptual models on a regular basis, or after what time period? Because there's always more research happening that fills in prior uncertainties. And
yeah, so I think, the updating your conceptual model should be sort of an ongoing process. However, we have our diagram here and a giant technical report. I think it's not necessarily important to go back to that giant technical report and add in the latest citations if they're supporting the same conclusions. If we do a bunch of monitoring and a bunch of new studies come out that shows us that actually aquatic vegetation isn't as important as we thought it was, then we really should go back and put out a new edition of the report, change our diagram, do whatever we have. But the conceptual model is a diagram, but more importantly, it's the idea of how it works, and reinforcing the idea of how it works and going back to it in our reports on the individual restoration sites, in publications. That should be done whenever you need to, but in terms of actually re-putting out the original report, that probably would only be if we find that there's a major mistake or updated new information that really changes our conceptual model.
yeah, that makes sense. So somebody should keep an eye out to see if it's necessary, but
yeah.
Okay. Great. Are there any other questions? If not, oh, Chelsea, go ahead.
Hey, Rosie, great talk. Thank you for that. I am curious to hear your thoughts about, maybe you've heard people discussing the need to integrate social science and human dimensions in conceptual models. And so, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm wondering what you think about the scale at which that should occur, in what situations that should occur, for this kind of FERT model. Is there need to incorporate human dimensions into kind of these more species specific or process specific, biological or chemical process specific models, or, when is that appropriate and how do we start to do that?
That is something that we specifically did not include in this model because we didn't have the expertise, and our charge was just fish. However, I think that was kind of ended up not being a good move, and it would have been better if we did incorporate some of these social science issues into this model of wetland restoration, because we are having to deal with surrounding landowners not being happy with some of the restoration sites, issues with being required to provide public access on some of the restoration sites, and not really being sure whether public access or some of the issues neighbors have with the restoration is something that is compatible with restoration, or is this something that we should be avoiding?
Great, thank you.
All right. Rosie, there's one more question in the chat, but we need to move on. If you can maybe answer that, that would be
Sure.
great in the chat. All right, our next talk is by Sarah Lesmeister with the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, and she is talking about incorporating adaptive management into funding proposals. Sarah, are you ready?
Yes, I am. I'm pulling up my PowerPoint right now, so please let me know if there's any issues. Okay, can you guys see that? Great.
Yep.
All right, so good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Sarah Lesmeister, and I am the Ecological and Community Programs Manager at the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. Part of my role in this position is overseeing the Proposition 1 grant program, which funds restoration projects in the Delta. Today, I will be providing a high-level overview of funding adaptive management in proposals and projects. The outline for my talk is pretty simple. I will have an introduction, which includes barriers to adaptive management. After that, I will go into the 5 W's, so basically the who, what, where, when, why, and how funding of adaptive management occurs. Next, I will go over the importance of adaptive management and provide an example from one of the projects that the Delta Conservancy and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife are working on. So, at this point in the workshop, many of you are probably tired of seeing the adaptive management life cycle. But there's a common saying that says you have to see something 7 times before you fully remember it. So I'll be really happy if everyone knows the 9 steps here. I'm not going to go into the details, but there are 3 main phases to the adaptive management cycle: the plan, do, and evaluate/respond. So when I see the adaptive management cycle, I immediately think of the project life cycle. So today, as part of this presentation, I wanted to discuss the 2, or blend the 2, and then discuss them. So project management is the application of knowledge, skills, and tools and techniques to project activities to meet those project requirements. Similar to adaptive management, there are 5 steps to project management lifecycle: the initiate, plan, execute, monitor, and close out. In my opinion, funding for adaptive management is really similar to funding the process of any project. So before we get into the funding portion of my talk, I wanted to share some of the barriers for adaptive management. A 2007 meta-analysis of over 100 ecological studies identified 3 main barriers to implementing adaptive management. The first barrier is the high-level decision makers' understanding of adaptive management. This does not include the project managers or people directly working on projects with an adaptive management component. Rather, it is the high-level or elected officials who are removed from the day-to-day decisions of adaptive management projects. As many of you guys are familiar with, adaptive management can be really complex and kind of squishy. This kind of uncertainty can make decision makers uncomfortable. So it's our responsibility as stewards of adaptive management to continue to work with decision makers on understanding its long-term value. The second barrier to adaptive management is lack of leadership for complex implementation of adaptive management. This example is especially true in the Delta, where there are various agencies participating in projects like restoration. Further, these activities are infinitely complex because of the various laws, agencies, personnel, social, and environmental factors. The sheer amount of information and complexity can make it difficult to lead and execute adaptive management. Finally, the third barrier and the focus of this talk is funding. Long-term, so more than 5 years, funding is just challenging in general. Relatively, it's much easier to get funding for small projects. long-term projects, especially those with an adaptive management component, may be more challenging. So great. Now we know funding for adaptive management is a consistent problem across the world. But what about the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta? A study published in 2017 in this San Francisco Estuary and Watershed Science by Wines et al. Described 3 barriers to adaptive management in the Delta. In no particular order, these barriers include environmental review, permitting, and funding. Fortunately, our Natural Resources Agency Secretary Wade Crowfoot has a new initiative called Cutting the Green Tape that calls on agency scientists and managers to reduce the bureaucracy related to environmental projects in the state of California. Other talks and sessions in this workshop elaborate on how we collectively and as a community can work together to address these bureaucracy issues. Here I highlight some areas that we can work together on to address funding adaptive management. So let's get started on how and when we can tackle the funding problem. So I guess the main take home for me for my presentation is that addressing adaptive management should be done in the planning phase of a project. This will identify the time and resources necessary to do the adaptive management. You have to incorporate funding into the planning stage because you need to know how, or you need to know what time and resources you have available to carry out those activities. For example, your adaptive management plan will look very different if you have $1,000 and let's say 1,000 staff hours versus having $100,000 and 5,000 staff hours. You cannot create an effective adaptive management plan unless you know what resources you have available, and your resources are highly dependent on what funding is available. You can create different adaptive management plans for a project dependent on how much funding is received. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing issue. You can have various versions of your adaptive management. Fortunately, there are some requirements and language that can be included into agreements and duty statements and more that address funding adaptive management. So funding requirements. The Delta Reform Act of 2009 legally requires adaptive management for all restoration activities in the Delta. If it's legally required to include adaptive management, it's easier to secure funding and carry out adaptive management. One recent example, Rosie talked about it earlier, of including the requirement of adaptive management is in the biological opinions for operations of the water projects and also the 2019 incidental take permit for the long-term operations of the State Water Project. The adaptive management component is explicitly written into the permit. Therefore, managers, supervisors, and staff can then explicitly request resources to address, including funding, to address that requirement. Another example that is in the state of California is the California Protection Area Management Program. They legally require people to have an adaptive management component. So regulators of environmental programs and projects should include adaptive management as a requirement for those programs in which they oversee. Next up, I will go over some of the funding sources. So there are many avenues to secure funding for adaptive management. This is not an all-inclusive list. It's 4 main ones that I'm familiar with. First, and the one I'm most recently familiar with, is through grant programs like the Proposition 1 grant program. In this program and similar grant programs, adaptive management activities like monitoring, reporting, analysis, and similar are elements of the grant application review process. In addition to other factors, the adaptive management element is part of the scoring and selection for awarding funding. Another source of funding for adaptive management is via contracts with programs that require but are unable to complete adaptive management themselves. Programs can have contracts to execute adaptive management activities, or people can apply for contracts to do adaptive management work. Basically, it's a two-way street that's back and forth between the funding opportunity in the Delta and then also the the agencies and then the applicants. An out-of-the-box idea that I've started seeing more recently for funding adaptive management is through endowments. If you're a nonprofit, you can consider creating and using an endowment fund to support adaptive management and long-term needs of monitoring. Finally, funding for adaptive management can be simply just a part of a program's costs. Supervisors, managers, human resource personnel, administrative staff, and others can add adaptive management and the resultant tasks to staff's job duties and descriptions. Further, managers and supervisors can build adaptive management into their culture of their work, just like you would do quality assurance, a quality assurance project plan, data transparency, data management, and similar activities. So for me, when I was creating this presentation, I thought of two main groups of people when it comes to funding for adaptive management. For this presentation, I'm calling those that have / control the funding as the funding groups. The second group, the ones that want the funding, or what I'm calling the funding applicants. So this is not an all-inclusive list, but just some examples of who may be funding projects with adaptive management components. Grant program managers, they may require adaptive management as a requirement of grant applications. That's someone like me in my role. As stated earlier, grant managers should include quantitative scoring of adaptive management as part of the application review process. Project managers, projects like restoration projects may have an adaptive management element. If work cannot be completed with in-house expertise, it may be necessary to contract with outside expertise. Project managers can request adaptive management as a part of the contract and evaluate bidders based on their successfulness in conducting adaptive management. Project managers may also want to develop in-house expertise by funding adaptive management training for their staff. Securing that funding and identifying appropriate training is a potential role of that project manager. Regulators also have the ability to facilitate funding by making adaptive management a regulated requirement. If it's not written down as a requirement, it's challenging, if not impossible, for staff and managers to request resources to fully execute adaptive management. I consider the funding group as kind of a top-down approach to obtaining funds for adaptive management. So in contrast to the top-down approach for funding adaptive management, it can also come from the bottom. As shown in the organizational logos here, funding groups, like a good example is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, can also be funding applicants. So there may be some overlaps between funding applicants and funding groups. Funding applicants can be broader than funding groups. For example, it can also be agencies, so other agencies, academia, businesses, nonprofits, local cities and counties, and more. As a bottom-up approach, funding applicants can add adaptive management to the application proposal and or their scope of work, even if it's not required. It may be difficult for funding agencies to cut adaptive management from a budget, given the benefits, which I will go over in the next slide. Incorporating adaptive management into proposals doesn't have to be a lot of work. Even though you're more than welcome to, applicants don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to including adaptive management. Applicants can leverage language and ideas obtained from workshops like this one into their proposals. The 2007 paper by Walters et al. Suggests just having a standard line item in a budget. A good example is like 10% to cover adaptive management activities. Applicants should also consider including concrete deliverables and or products associated with adaptive management. These deliverables can be something just as simple as meeting net attendance and meeting notes, or up to adaptive management plans and more. So why should funding applicants request more money to do more work? Well, there are several benefits to incorporating and funding adaptive management. First, the costs of adaptive management are relatively small to the cost of unexpected outcomes or making irreversible mistakes. Funding adaptive management also increases the likelihood of a project's success. It also allows for project leads to analyze and confirm factors that cause a project's success or failure, so it's kind of getting a lessons learned. And finally, funding adaptive management allows for the best science available to inform decision making. So that goes back to some of the general barriers to implementing adaptive management. So before I end my talk, I wanted to provide a nice example of the importance of including adaptive management into a project. This example is an agreement in place between the Delta Conservancy's Proposition 1 grant program and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is an ongoing project, but the goal is to monitor, contain, and eradicate nutria populations in California, especially within the Delta. For those of you who are not familiar, nutria is a beaver-like rodent that is new to the Delta. It's an ecosystem engineer and can threaten wetland habitat, levees, and more. And it reproduces and spreads rapidly. So for traditional or non-adaptive management projects, the grant would call for the grantee to monitor and to monitor, contain, and eradicate nutria at the same sites year after year using the same technology. Under normal circumstances, if the grantee wanted to change their sites or modify their technology, they would have to do an amendment or modification. Unfortunately, these modifications and amendments can take a lot of time and a lot of resources and cause you can basically lose out on the opportunity to lose a lot of time. In contrast, and so how we worked and how CDFW worked to design this this grant agreement is including an adaptive management component. This allows the grantee to confer with other experts, identify and use those emerging technologies, and adjust monitoring sites and make small changes in a timely and effective manner. As a result, the collective we get better information about nutria and are better able to monitor, control, and eradicate, which is the goal of the study. These directly benefit the project and ultimately the goals for the broader community. So to summarize, funding is consistently listed as a barrier to implementing adaptive management. Adaptive management isn't free. You can't just add it to a list of tasks and deliverables and say it's not going to cost any money. It costs money to do it. Addressing adaptive management should be completed in the planning stage of a project. We shouldn't wait for funding to be addressed from the top or a bottom. We can collectively address funding adaptive management from both a top-down and bottom-up approach simultaneously. Finally, adaptive management reduces a project risk and increases the likelihood of a project success. So I want to ask you, and I want to ask others, why wouldn't we fund it? And with that, I can take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Great talk. I especially appreciated your ideas on how to ensure long-term monitoring even after projects close. Are there any questions for Sarah? So please raise your hand or write them into the chat. Maybe
Rosa has one.
Okay.
Yeah, you had said, 10 to 20% of your budget for adaptive management. Was that including like long-term monitoring? Because I feel like a robust long-term monitoring program, depending on how long, could be quite a bit more than 10% of a project's budget.
Yeah, no, that would be a completely separate line item within the budget. I just see that literally being when you have a line item for adaptive management, that's saying that we are going to take the time to analyze, review our data, do that work, and change our long-term monitoring as needed. So you would have like 10% as adaptive management, but rightfully so, that your long-term monitoring would likely be more like 60% of your budget, right? And then another 10% for project management and so on.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah.
Chelsea, do you want to read your question or speak up?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Thanks for that talk, Sarah. That was really enlightening for me, especially being fairly new to the Delta. I was just curious if you had any thoughts about, sometimes if you're writing a budget and you want to use sort of like innovative or experimental or things that might carry a higher risk. And like, I can imagine from a funding agency perspective, you might look at that and say, well, we don't really need to do any of that to execute this project. So how would you suggest justifying those kinds of costs?
Yeah, so I also see this as part of why you would want to add or have a line item for adaptive management, right? You would say, okay, we're going to be spending this much money, or let's say 10% of the budget to adjust or change your monitoring design or your special project design, but you could have that be part of it and use those special studies to inform the actual monitoring. So I see it as more of a partnership rather than like one or the other.
Great. One more question. I think we have the time. Susan, go ahead.
Hi, this morning's panel is terrific. My question is to do with funding scenarios. If in your planning of adaptive management, do you have funding scenario A, funding scenario B, et cetera, and then So that brings you to a adaptive management plan A, adaptive management plan B. Is that done?
So what I see it though, right, is that you would be entering into some sort of discussion with, let's say, your funding group, right? And they're going to look at the budget and be like, oh, we only have, $100,000 for this project. We can do adaptive management for, let's say, $10,000. What can be done with $10,000 for adaptive management? Are you going to add in the new technology, right? So adaptive management plan A could be just investigating new technology. Adaptive management plan B could be adding additional sites. Adaptive management plan C could be some sort of hybrid of that. So I don't necessarily see it as having like a whole nother, like multiple ones going out. It's just part of the discussion. And then once that agreement or that funding's in place, you would then actually go down that path. That makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Great talk, great discussion. Let's move on to the next talk by Rod Whitler with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And he is talking about structured decision making for the Central Valley, I don't get it, CVPIA, Central Valley Project Improvement Act, something like that. There you go.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning, Rod. Yes, I can hear you and see your slides.
Are you seeing my slides?
I am, yes.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak to this. Very happy to speak on behalf of the science integration team, and in particular, Adam Duarte, James Peterson, Mike Colvin, Kevin McDonald, Mike Kirchhoff, and our new science coordinator, Megan Cook. So I presume that you know a little bit about CVPIA. It's a large program, landscape scale, habitat restoration, sponsored by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Been active since 1992. In 2008, the program underwent an independent review, and we got a little tough love from the water and power, our water and power customers. They basically said we needed to do a better job, and mostly, we needed to rethink our entire approach and do a fundamentally better job and move towards a science-based decision-making methodology. And it's amazing to me that to this day, I often think of the major recommendations of that report and our progress on implementing them. The point is having a goal to follow, and keeping the goal in front of the organization is very powerful. So we look back to this review, even though it seems like 2008 was a long time ago, its recommendations are extremely pertinent to what we're doing today. So we picked the science-based decision-making process. We're using structured decision-making, which is a quantitative form of adaptive management, and it fits within single loop and double loop adaptive management quite well. I won't show the wheel but this is essentially the same thing. So developing our set of priorities, or doing our system analysis is the unique aspect of this, in my opinion. So we did the structured decision-making first, where we completed several iterations of that, and we're now transitioning the structured decision-making into adaptive management. So we've gone through 3 phases. Our first phase was 2013 to 2014. We included the people on it were the core team members and the discipline experts. We had a series of workshops, and we developed our fundamental objectives. The most impressionable action we took for me was a separation of fundamental and means objectives, where fundamental objectives are where we want to be, means objectives are how we get there. It revolutionized the way I thought about problem solving and fostered a unified vision of effort. We had clarity. We knew what we were doing. And these were our fundamental objectives at that time. So we had our fundamental objective was naturally reproducing self-sustaining populations of Chinook salmon, spring, fall, late fall, and winter run. And then we had the sub-objectives, or the means objectives, underneath those, the things that we wanted to do. And of course we said, are we there yet? Because it seemed like we'd been working a long time and made a lot of progress, but we had a long ways to go. Then we became inclusive before we became focused. We had to set the spatial dimensions of our system analysis. So we picked a course resolution. It's a watershed-based, lumped main stems. The delta was only in 2 sections, north and south. And our focus was primarily outside of the delta because it was focused on salmon again. The temporal scale was a 20-year time period using calcium flows and temperature inputs from that. Our model that we put together, our life cycle model that we put together, is this, and you can study it to your heart's content. It had a total of 51 parameters. And I'll just say that the arrows between the circles represent the state of the population. The arrows represent a submodel that transitions them from state to state. And all the models, submodels combined, we had 51 total parameters. That seemed like a bunch at the time, but the number was to grow. And the purpose of system modeling is to design scenarios that meet the fundamental objectives. In our case, the model can select a set of actions that optimize abundance, or it can select a set of actions that optimize spatial diversity. Where did we get the information? Well, we started collecting empirical data, published reports, and did some expert elicitation. Don't underestimate the types and amounts of data required to undertake either structured decision-making or adaptive management. But you have to work to become comfortable with differing levels of accuracy and precision when it comes to available data. You'll never know it all or even much, but decisions still need to be made. Our top-ranked decisions through this first phase was to increase in-channel habitat and manipulate temperatures for juveniles, provide better temperatures. Our lowest ranked actions were to increase floodplain habitat and increase spawning habitat. And the reason for that was rather intuitive. What we found is that we have enough spawning habitat. We can spawn more fish than we have room to rear their juveniles. So that put the emphasis on more in-channel habitat. And then with regards to floodplain habitat, though it's extremely valuable and has a higher growth rate, with the way the CVP is operated, it's not inundated frequently enough. We found the floodplain habitat to be marginal in terms of production increases. Let's see, let me go on here. Then we did a sensitivity analysis. Okay, we have this nice system model. What is our model sensitive to? What are the factors that drive it? And these are the factors that most impacted the model incomes and thus the resulting management priorities. And this was my first introduction to what Jim Peterson calls his rule of 6. And the rule of 6 is no matter how many inputs, no more than 6 will govern the output. And I'm finding that to be a good truism. So what did we learn through phase 1? We learned the process, doing system analysis. We learned the importance of data availability. We identified the key uncertainties that we had with our limited information. And we found that it gets better, the structured decision-making process, with more stakeholders and disciplines in the room. So phase 2 began in 2015. We inaugurated the science integration team. We held a series of workshops, calls, all that good stuff. And you can find our website down there. We continue to build public support and ownership in the decision-making process. We produced annual technical memoranda, which were statements of priorities as our structured decision-making capabilities grew. And we began in earnest to prepare for the near-term restoration strategy, a statement of CVPIA's priorities for the next 5 years and the roadmap for committing our resources. We developed governance guidelines and found that this was very useful. It wasn't hard to do, and it really only comes into play with folks that are new to our process while providing a baseline of how we intend it to work. We did start over, though. When we had all these new folks join the process, it was important to go back and restate our fundamental and means objectives again so that everybody had buy-in to the process. So we basically started over. And these are our latest set of fundamental objectives and attributes, 10 value-wide objectives and 8 tributary objectives. Now, whenever we get into debating objectives, we can pull this out and say, we already discussed this, and this is a result of our deliberations. Has anything changed that would lead us to update these objectives? And we find that to be a real time saver. We don't have to argue over what's important. We already have. We updated and refined our geographic scope in this phase and the detail of the system we are analyzing. We especially focus on adding the bypasses, the flood bypasses, and their value to the production in the system. We went back to our model and we refined our model, added more complexity to it. Now we're up from 51 to 87 parameters in the model. It's more complex, but have we added precision or accuracy, or most importantly, insight? Is the new model giving us more insight than the old model? We had to go through the model parameterization again, and where did we get the information? So again, we went back to the well and said, we need more information, and really started pumping, for it, and we produced more. So structured decision making and adaptive management are all about the data, not more data, but the right data. So then we started to analyze our scenarios, our fundamental objectives. We went a little crazy here though, because we felt the power. We whacked ourselves with 1,872 sets of model output to sort through and make sense of. And it was we just got buried in model output. We needed to go there to learn a lesson, which means we needed to be more selective about the scenarios that we looked at and all that. We then did the sensitivity analysis, and again, now we'd increased to 87 parameters. But out of those 87 parameters, the ones that most impacted the model were pretty much the same ones that had impacted during phase 1. So the key that comes out of this when you do the sensitivity analysis, it tells you what data is most important in your system, and that allows you to focus your dollars on the data that clears your vision, not the data that satisfies your curiosity. And that's been a very powerful tool for us as well. Phase 3, 2018 to now. We really began our push for our first 5-year plan. We had been doing 1-year plans. Now we wanted to stretch it out to 5. And future resource commitments from the Bureau of Reclamation and CVPI are going to be made on the outcomes of this process. So again, more expansions to the model. This time we subdivided the delta. Instead of just having 2 segments in the delta, we've expanded the delta to 13 segments. We're now up to 163 parameters in our model. And we went a little bit crazy, but in the sense of inclusion, if somebody wanted it in there, it's in there. The team thinks more is better from a consideration standpoint, but the real question is does it make a difference in model output and the subsequent prioritization? So out of those 163 parameters, it was this set, again, that really governed the output. These are the ones that have the most impact upon the solution. So the confidence in the outcomes rises after consideration of many more input parameters. But even so, there are still questions that the SIT will debate and the models will illuminate. So now we have published our near-term restoration strategy, or right on the verge of doing that. It'll be available here very shortly, widely through our website. These are the 9 actions that form our strategy that optimizes abundance and spatial diversity of these salmonids in the Central Valley. And we intend to pursue these priorities now for the next roughly 5 years until the science integration team winds back up again and repeats the process in a phase 4 and restates these priorities in a new form. So what are the lessons that we've learned so far? Structured decision-making is hard, but doable. You don't need all the information up front. You do need courage to make educated estimates and the willingness to be flexible and revisit debated values and methods. After 7 years, we're just now getting to adaptive management. Structured decision-making and adaptive management are not the same. Teamwork is key. Data management is a must from the beginning. Structured decision-making is not terribly expensive, and it may be less expensive than the alternatives. It helps to read up on systems analysis, and then the rule of 6, no matter how complex the system, no more than 6 inputs generally govern the output. where are we headed to next? Adaptive management. So what is that going to look like? So we have what we call the state-dependent policy charts. And using the model, the systems analysis, we can fabricate these types of if-then relationships. So again, what this says is, I look at spawning habitat per red and through my monitoring program, and I come up here with a value, and I find I'm going to be in one of three zones on this chart when I compare it to juvenile rearing habitat. And again, so I add spawning habitat, that creates a necessity for rearing habitat. I add rearing habitat, that opens up room for more spawning habitat. And eventually I get to the point where I want to be improving survivability more than I want to be adding habitat. And if you pursue these stair steps, pursue this policy plot, you increase your overall production. And go through this real quick. We've divided the Central Valley into 6 regions, and we are developing a policy plot for each of those 6 regions, which then puts us into this if-then mode. If we're in this mode, then take this action. And these policy plots now have a lifespan of about 5 years, and they tell our managers what to do based upon the data that we are monitoring, observing in the system. So with that, I'm going to stop and take any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Rod. That was really interesting. What a process. Susan is asking, what prompted adding the 13 parameters for the delta?
We had begun a structured decision-making process separately in the delta for the other than salmonid species. And Russ Perry with the USGS had been working there. And based upon that, the prototyping effort of structured decision-making in the delta, they had separated the delta into 13 zones. Of course, it helped that Jim Peterson was running both efforts, and so it was very easy to coordinate that. We always knew that our initial representation of the delta was too simple, and we were looking for the opportunity to expand that.
Great, thank you, Rod.
Clint, you put a long question or a couple questions into the chat. Would you like to speak up, or would you like me to read those?
Yeah, sorry, long-winded Canadian today. Rod, can you see the chat?
I'm looking for it, but I'm not seeing it. It says you can't send messages because you're not a member of the chat. I don't know why that is.
Okay. Well, no, I had a 2-part question. You can take both or none, or one of the parts. Great, ton of work, really interesting. Part 1 was, is there a plan for aligning the fall run Chinook model with other species models, possibly smelt or other objectives, to kind of look at how to balance objectives for multiple species? That's part 1.
So we ran, in this case, we ran 3 salmonid models. We ran a fall run, a winter run, and a spring run model, and then interpreted those outcomes to get to the priorities that I showed you there. Yes, we do head that way. Our next model is steelhead and then sturgeon. Smelt is out there on the horizon somewhere.
Will those models sort of be integrated somehow or run independently?
They are headed towards integration. Right now they are run separately, and then the output is compared and integrated through the SIT process, the deliberations of the science integration team. But we do intend to integrate the salmonid models because they share the same physical habitats just at different times. So that integration of the salmonid models is planned. Sturgeon and smelt will probably remain outstanding on their own.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I don't want to dominate, so I have a second part, but I can see if there's others that want to ask questions.
Sarah is asking, and we're quickly running out of time, so I quickly read it. She says, great presentation. Has the rule of 6 reduced the need for more monitoring?
Yes, I wouldn't say necessarily reduced, but it's made it a whole lot easier for us to choose where to put our financial resources. There's still interest in a lot of other things, but we now know what our priority data information needs is. And in the near-term restoration strategy, the SIT has also these 9 actions, but it also has 4 sets of data information needs, one for salmonids, one for steelhead, one for sturgeon, and I can't remember the other one, but it helps us prioritize where the dollars are going. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much, Rod. That was a great presentation. Good questions, everybody. I should mention really quickly, there seems to be a glitch with Teams and the chat. And if you cannot see the chat but would like to, you could try leaving the meeting and coming back in. But now let's go on to our last speaker of this session, Chris Bowles with CBC Ecoengineering is talking about quantitative modeling, Southport levee with regard to the Southport levee setback project. Chris, are you there? Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so thanks so much. Okay, share content. One moment. Okay, this one. Okay. Well, can everybody see my presentation now?
Yes, perfect.
Great, thank you. Well, my job has been made so much easier by a fantastic session that has really set the scene. I'm coming in now at the end of this session to really give an overview of a case study that touches on the whole adaptive management cycle from plan, do, evaluate, and respond. So thank you so much for being invited to speak here. It's a big honor and I'm very pleased to do so. So I'm going to be talking about quantitative modeling, hydrodynamic modeling and sediment transport modeling in relation to input into this life cycle, adaptive management cycle. And the project I'm going to be using is the Southport levee setback. I did just want to acknowledge my other co-conspirators or authors, John Stofflet, Doug Shields, Sam Diaz, and then, of course, Paul Dirksen, who was an integral part in making this whole project happen. So what am I going to be talking about? I'll give a bit of location and context to this case study, talk a bit about the mitigation and restoration requirements, and then go on to the monitoring and adaptive management pieces of how our physical design and modeling integrated into these various stages of an adaptive management plan. So, project location context. The project is in West Sacramento. The image on the left here with the box nestled on the Sacramento River between West Sacramento and Sacramento. It's approximately a 4-mile reach of the Sacramento River on the west side or right bank of the Sacramento River. And the image on the right, these 2 polygons that you see, if you can see my mouse, hopefully, this was the existing levee adjacent to the river, obviously tucked right up against the river. And the westerly line in each polygon is the new setback orientation. This blob in the middle of riparian vegetation is called Bees Lakes, and there's two marinas, the Sacramento Yacht Club and Sherwood Marina, right in the middle of this reach. There is actually a restoration project being planned for Bees Lakes currently by West Safeco. And then what's not shown is the setback levee extends behind Bees Lake to protect this whole area of Southport in West Sacramento. The gaps in the existing levee are breaches, inlets. So the upper offset area, the northern offset area, as this is known, really functions as a backwater, and then the southern offset area, part of it operates as a flow through, and then the other part operates as a backwater. Now, what makes this project so unique and such a wonderful opportunity to work on, a chance of a lifetime opportunity really, is that the floodplain was excavated, the offset floodplain, the setback floodplain, was excavated by 10 feet, so about 20 feet NAVD down to 10 feet NAVD. What does that mean? Well, massive amounts of earthworks which were used to build the new setback levee. But ecologically, a tremendous opportunity to have a highly connected floodplain to the Sacramento River. We know that so many of our rivers have disconnected floodplains due to anthropogenic impacts, and typically we look at the bypasses as being our most important floodplains. But here we've got 120 acres of created floodplain that's inundated for extensive periods of nearly every year, and that doesn't happen on the bypasses. So ecologically, a blank slate to create something really unique. So a tremendous opportunity. So I'm doing here exactly what you're told not to in presentations, lots and lots of text, but I've got to get this in, document it, read it at your will. But the requirements for mitigation and restoration were due to these unavoidable impacts on habitats and species. There's been mention of 404, the biological opinions in prior presentations. You all know about that, I think. Elderberry and GGS, giant garter snake, was done off-site. There was no suitable habitat on-site for that. And then the focus were on species like Swainson's hawks, Chinook, steelhead, green sturgeon. And so 152 acres was available for mitigation, restoration planning, and 120 acres below the ordinary high water mark that were focused on forest and native trees and special status fish species. And then, of course, the adaptive management and monitoring plan, which was created a long time ago and then has been updated more recently, following a typical format, defining the baseline, O&M, management, monitoring, success criteria, adaptive management, etc. So the goals and objectives of the monitoring and adaptive management, the original AMP preceded adoption of the Delta Plan, but it's highly consistent and got determination that it was appropriate. And the design had to be compatible for the project and for the adaptive management plan with all these criteria listed here, which I'm not going to go through. But the monitoring objectives focused on the hydrologic and hydraulic performance of the restored floodplain, the success of the plantings, the effectiveness of grading to minimize fish stranding, minimize, not prevent fish stranding. We can never prevent fish stranding, especially in a naturally evolving system, right? And then looking at sedimentation and scour that could compromise the success of the restoration project. So design criteria that we followed to design this mosaic of habitats and topographic heterogeneity. We focused on CBEC's role in terms of the physical design process. We worked with biologists and ecologists from ICF and GEI, but our role was really the yellow highlights here. So looking at historic Sacramento River flows, the hydrology and hydraulics of the Sacramento River to inform the current condition and future trajectory. And we modeled various different scenarios looking at critical parameters such as inundation area, frequency, timing, duration, depth, velocity, over this mosaic and topographic heterogeneity from which the biologists help us design the vegetative communities that would meet the objectives of the mitigation and restoration. We talked about topographic heterogeneity, low flow swales, which would also be habitat areas, and assist in drainage on the receding limb of the hydrograph and minimize stranding. And then various terraces at all different elevations for different types of riparian species and juvenile rearing. So I think we've covered that slide. So getting on to the nitty gritty of the modeling, a two-dimensional model was created for a long reach upstream and downstream of the project. And we use this hydrodynamic model to look at inundation frequency, timing, duration, all those parameters. I haven't got time to go into the derivation of flows for various species. That's a whole presentation in itself, but I think you're all familiar with floodplain activation flow that various people, Phil Williams, Betty Andrews, worked on years and years ago, and a bunch of biologists 20 years ago. But that's come on some way. There's new techniques. But this 30,000 CFS here is for typical, is a recommended typical juvenile rearing criteria for Chinook salmon for when you get duration for at least 14 days between December and May for 2 out of 3 years. And you interrogate the hydrology, derive what the flow is, then put that flow through the two-dimensional model, and hey presto, you get this inundation pattern that you then test for other criteria such as depth and velocity using habitat suitability curves. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but what this gives us is we looked at the topographic heterogeneity and tried to get as much diversity as we could through the model, which involved myself and some biologists scribbling all over huge plan sheets, testing that in the model, adjusting and refining. So this is the southern offset area, and then the northern, and then another design criteria flow of 70,000 CFS, which was a 21-day duration for between December and May for 2 out of 3 years. And then all being well, this animation works. Yay, it worked. I hope it's coming through my internet connection. But this shows a typical inundation pattern as flows break out into the floodplain. You see the flow through, you see the backwater, you can see these low flow swales inundating, they're blue right now. You see the uplands inundating at lower depths. You see the velocity vectors here, which were critical not just for habitat, aquatic habitat, juvenile habitat parameters, but also those velocity vectors helped inform where sedimentation could occur, where scour could occur. Sediment transport modeling is not an exact science, and hence we fall back on adaptive management, as you're going to see here very shortly. So there's the animation of inundation. Talking about sediment transport as not being an exact science, we use sediment transport modeling to look at not only what sedimentation patterns would look like with and without the project in the main channel, but also where sediment could possibly develop on the floodplain. We want sedimentation on the floodplain. We want natural topographic heterogeneity. You don't just want a mosaic of topographic elevations created by a crazy engineer ecological engineer like me. You want natural sedimentation, but ideally you don't want it blocking swells and channels if we can help it. But it's very difficult to get it accurately correct. So we get orders of magnitude of sedimentation. That's the best you can say. You may get up to 3 feet here. You may get up to 10 feet here. But seeing some of these natural crevasse splays that occurred is just a living laboratory, really cool. And you'll see that in a minute. So what did we end up with through this planning process? This mosaic of habitats, and you see the whole listed targeted species, everything from Tule Marsh all the way through mixed riparian scrub and willow and riparian cottonwood forest, etc. So really, like I say, this palette of different habitats. And then typical cross section, this is actually through a breach, an inlet. You see the red dotted line as the historic pre-project condition, and the post-project design condition is the rest. And you can see huge sections of levee were removed, big setback areas, plantings all over the place, tules at the inlets to try and provide stability to the inlets. You don't want those inlets really to move. You don't want the Sacramento River jumping into this offset area. So in terms of the fish habitat, we used an earlier version, a derivation of the habitat quantification tool, really using area duration frequency curves, which is something that's come from traditional flood engineering, but we and others have adapted it to habitat. So firstly, though, you look at this longitudinal profile, you see the existing floodplain elevation as that dark blue line in the upper part of the graph, 20 feet. You see the 2 red vertical boxes, which look between those 2 vertical boxes. That's our project reach. You look at the floodplain elevation after construction around 10 feet, the swales around 7 feet, and then look at those water surface profiles. Particularly look at the red water surface profile and the blue. Those are two different criteria of hydrology for either Chinook salmon 21-day or the 14-day, which is the blue line. And you see that for the Chinook 14-day duration, significant inundation of the floodplain. In the lower flow, the red profile, you see just the swales getting inundated. And then talking about these area duration frequency curves, again, how this is derived, this is a whole presentation. So trust me, I think many of you will have seen those types of presentation on habitat quantification tools, but we quantified approximately the area acreages of potential habitat for these different species. And so when you plot these area duration frequencies based on hydrodynamic modeling and hydrologic analysis, we found that we got about 80 acres of the 2 out of 3 year criteria, and then up to 130 acres for the higher flow, the 1 out of 3 year duration, which was really valuable to optimize both the magnitude of the habitat, but also the quality. I didn't actually mention in-stream woody material. This barren looking floodplain in the first year, we recognized that we needed some refugia, some habitat until the riparian vegetation grew. So if you look at this CAD plot, you see the contours with the swales and the heterogeneity. And then if you look at the blue and the red dots, those are locations of in-stream woody material. And this was optimized based on cost, but also habitat quality. And here's a zoom to the southern part of the south offset. So we came up with different orientations of in-stream woody material, from single members to 4 members. Really great fun designing and building these things. Some photos of during construction. I think a lot of these trees were from almond orchards in woodland. Anchored, very important to anchor and lash these structures. You don't want these things floating downstream. Ultimately, they will rot away and move downstream, but by that time, you've got a dense riparian forest out here. I should say this is a traditional water resources engineer's nightmare to look at something like this, but for an ecological engineer, it's very cool and sexy to see these things. So some photos of the project. Got a bunch of these, can't show many here. This is pre-project, looking from the south to the north. During construction, some of the inlets with the swales, and in years to come, you won't see these swales from aerials. But this was just after construction of one of the southern offsets, zoom in there. And then my artist's impression of what this might look like in 10 years, probably less than that, actually 5 years. You wouldn't see those swales though. And then a typical cross section through there. Now, adaptive, just an example of adaptive management. So we had a couple of trail cams out there connected to the web, and we watched them every day, particularly after the first inundation of construction. And lo and behold, what did we see? Uh-oh, sediment, 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 sediment. Huge crevasse splays, huge areas of deposition, which we said would happen, but they were probably a bit bigger than we said would happen. But that's what adaptive management's all about, especially with non-exact modeling, sediment transport modeling. So we were pleased we said it would happen, but we actually saw more. And so what happened was they had to go back in and excavate a channel just to aid in drainage. So a really cool aerial there of that huge sediment splay. So this was part of the topographic heterogeneity, but what we saw is some really cool helical flow structures and deposition downstream of this area. And just to provide a bit of defensibility for myself and my other ecological engineers, this is a table out of the basis of design report where we predicted 3 feet of sediment. Maybe we got 3.5 feet of 4, but order of magnitude. But this is an extract from a paper from a guy I worked with back in the 90s, where he tried to look at the flow structure at inlets, and it's inherently, all flows three-dimensional in nature, right? We're only using a two-dimensional model here, but to predict this kind of three-dimensional helical flow structure is impossible. And this is why you get these types of deposition at inlets. They are crevasse splays, and crevasse splays happen in nature. So other forms of monitoring that will be used for adaptive management, drone photography is going to be used extensively. And this is a mosaic of probably 1,500 aerial photos stitched together using ground control, and we can really zoom in. We're also using hyperspectral imaging to look at, and there was a mention of that in a prior talk, to look at the nature and quality and quantity of the types of vegetation, but we can really zoom in, really high quality. You can even see the excavator tracks. You can see the lines of the riparian vegetation. You can see, zooming right in, you can see these structures these cool and sexy structures that we built. So with that, I think I just got in on time. So there is a minute and a half for questions, I think. So thank you very much for this invitation, and special thanks to the rest of the team that I've mentioned here.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a great talk. We are in the break, but if you want to stick around, let's take a couple minutes for questions. Denise Reed is asking, how extensive was the dredging that was done after the sediment deposits? Did you put it back to the design, or just the design?
No. Like I said, Denise, we want heterogeneity, right? We want natural processes. It was literally the minimum we could do to minimize fish stranding and allow drainage on the receding limb of the hydrograph. And it's not going to go on forever. This excavation of trenches and drainage channels, well, once there's a dense riparian jungle, you won't see anything. You won't see the deposition because it'll be hidden by trees. But it's a crevasse splay. We just thought it should be drained, and in the short term at least. So no mass grading or regrading. Thanks, Denise.
Are there any other questions? Rod Whitler saying, an amazing project. Thanks for fitting fish aspects into a flood control project. Very opportunistic, very thoughtful.
Hey, I'm an ecological engineer, Rod. I'm not a flood engineer. And yeah, it was a chance of a lifetime. It's a unique project. I hope I get another one like this, but who knows?
All right. Well, thank you so much to all the speakers. This was a great session. I enjoyed every single talk and learned a lot. We have about 11 minutes for a break now. Please be back at 11 for the closing plenary. And yeah, thank you all for attending.